21 days of silence can dismantle a kingdom more effectively than an invading army. Doris knew this as she fastened the clasp of her statement pendant, the heavy gold cold against her collarbone. Watching her reflection transform in the vanity mirror, the woman staring back looked lethal. Crimson lips, an elegant updo that exposed the defiant line of her neck, and a deep red gown that clung to her curves like a second skin. Red, the color of passion, of warning, of blood. Taeyang hadn't looked at her properly in 3 weeks. She had counted every single second of that isolation. Their penthouse, once a sanctuary of whispered secrets and shared warmth, had become a mausoleum of unspoken words. Each high-ceilinged room echoed with the conversations they weren't having, the marble floors carrying the chill of a winter that had nothing to do with the weather outside. He had moved into the guest suite the night after the misunderstanding, though misunderstanding felt too clinical for the soul-crushing shift that had occurred. There had been no screaming, no shattered glass, no dramatic displays of Mafia-bred temper. There had only been the sight of Taeyang's face going absolutely blank as he stood in the hallway, overhearing a fragment of her phone call. Then the quiet final click of a door closing between them. That click might as well have been a gunshot. It had murdered the intimacy they had spent years building. Since then, Taeyang had perfected the art of existing in the same space as a ghost. He took breakfast in the kitchen while she was still asleep. He returned from the office long after the city lights had dimmed to a dull hum. On the rare occasions their paths crossed, he offered only a cold, sharp politeness, the kind of courtesy a king extends to a stranger he is forced to tolerate in an elevator. It was a special kind of torture, being guarded by a man who refused to see you. The modern furnishings and floor-to-ceiling windows of their high-rise felt less like luxury and more like a gilded cage. Doris reached for her matching bracelet, her fingers trembling slightly. The protection Taeyang insisted on was suffocating her. He thought he was keeping her safe from the rivalries and the blood-soaked politics of the Li Empire, but he was actually starving her of the only thing that made the danger bearable: him. Tonight, however, the silence would end. She wasn't dressing for the high society reunion. She was dressing for a declaration of war. If he wanted to treat her like a beautiful, static object in his museum, she would show him exactly how much damage a work of art could do when it decided to move. Doris stood up, the silk of her dress whispering against the floor. She checked her reflection one last time, confident, determined, and pulsing with a mixture of frustration and defiance. She grabbed her clutch and walked toward the bedroom door. Her heels clicked against the marble, a rhythmic, intentional challenge to the oppressive quiet of the hallway. Each step was a heartbeat, drumming out a single message: I am still here.
Before I tell you what happened next to Taeyang and Doris, hit the subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's dive into it. She reached the top of the grand staircase, her eyes fixed on the front door, sensing the heavy presence of the man she knew was waiting in the shadows of the living room. The mausoleum was about to be haunted. The descent down the grand staircase felt like a walk toward a firing squad, but Doris kept her chin high, the weight of the statement pendant grounding her. The silk of her gown swirled around her ankles, the deep crimson fabric catching the dim light of the penthouse like spilled wine. She didn't look toward the living room, but she could feel him. Taeyang was a presence that occupied space even when he was motionless, a storm front held in check by sheer force of will. As she reached the foyer, the silence of the last 21 days seemed to thicken, pressing against her eardrums. She reached the heavy oak door, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the cool metal of the handle. She was seconds away from the hallway, from the elevator, from the freedom of a night where she didn't have to be a ghost.
That dress isn't going anywhere, and neither are you.
The voice didn't just break the silence, it decimated it. It was low, gravelly, and cut through the air like a serrated blade. Doris froze, her hand still hovering over the latch. She didn't turn around immediately, savoring the first words he had spoken to her in 3 weeks, even if they were a command. She slowly looked over her shoulder, meeting his gaze. Taeyong was leaning against the far wall, his sharp black suit making him look like a shadow given form. He had his arms crossed over his chest, his posture radiating a dangerous, coiled energy. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark ink of the tattoos that climbed toward his throat, a stark, edgy contrast to the tailored luxury of his clothing. "I have plans, Taeyong. Since you've been living in the guest suite, I assumed my schedule was no longer your concern." He moved then, pushing off the wall with a predatory grace that made the hair on her arms stand up. He didn't stop until he was mere inches away, effectively trapping her between the door and the heat of his body. The scent of him, expensive sandalwood and something sharp, like ozone before a strike, filled her senses.
"Your schedule is always my concern," he countered, his eyes raking over the plunging neckline of her dress with an expression that shifted between possessive rage and agonizing hunger. "You aren't walking out of this door looking like a target."
"A target?" Doris let out a sharp, brittle laugh. "I've been a target since the day I took your name, but for the last 3 weeks, I've just been an ornament. I'm going out, Taeyang. I'm going to be seen, even if I have to find a room full of strangers to do it." Taeyang's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. His serious expression didn't flicker, but the restraint in his posture was fraying at the edges. He looked like a man trying to maintain control over a situation that had already spiraled into chaos. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her defiant eyes, the power dynamic in the room shifting like tectonic plates. "You aren't leaving," he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that vibrated in her chest. The doorway, once her exit, had become the stage for a confrontation 21 days in the making. Doris didn't flinch as Taeyong crowded her space. The heat radiating from him was a violent contrast to the 3 weeks of permafrost he had maintained. Up close, the restraint in his posture was even more terrifying. He looked like a man holding back an avalanche with his bare hands. She looked up at him, her statement pendant catching the hallway light, its steady glow mocking the turbulence in her chest. "Move, Taeyang. You don't get to play the concerned husband now, not after 21 days of acting like I was a piece of furniture you were tired of looking at." His eyes darkened, the pupils blowing wide until the amber of his irises was just a thin, jagged ring. One of his hands moved, his fingers curling into a fist against the wood of the door behind her. The ink of the tiger on his forearm seemed to ripple with the tension in his muscles. "I never stopped looking at you, Doris. Don't lie to yourself." "Looking at me, perhaps," she countered, stepping into his personal space until her chest almost brushed his unbuttoned shirt. "But you stopped seeing me. You've spent 3 weeks treating this home like a prison and me like its most inconvenient inmate. You moved into the guest suite without a word. You had your assistant tell me when you'd be home late. You walked past me in the halls like I was a ghost you were trying to ignore." She reached out, her fingers grazing the lapel of his sharp black suit. The fabric was expensive, cold, and impersonal, exactly like the man wearing it. "I am tired of being haunted in my own home, Taeyang. I am tired of the cold politeness. If you want me to be a target, then let me be one out there under the city lights, where at least the danger has a face. Because this silence, this invisible war you're waging, it's killing me faster than any rival family ever could." Taeyong's breath hitched, a ragged sound that broke through his polished exterior. For a split second, the mask of the Mafia boss slipped, revealing a raw, bleeding wound underneath. He looked down at her, his gaze fixated on the defiance in her eyes and the way her deep red gown made her look like a flame flickering in a dark room.
"You think I enjoyed it?" he rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over broken glass.
You think it was easy for me to be 10 feet away and not touch you, to hear you breathing in the next room and stay behind a locked door?
Then why did you do it? Doris demanded, her voice cracking for the first time. She pressed her hand against his chest, feeling the frantic, heavy thud of his heart against her palm. It was proof that he was still in there, somewhere behind the tattoos and the tailored suits and the terrifying reputation. Why did you turn our life into this mausoleum? Why did you make me feel like I had already lost you? His jaw worked, the muscle leaping with a frantic energy. He looked like he wanted to scream, to shatter the large windows behind them, to burn the whole world down just to stop the look of pain on her face. But instead, he stayed rooted to the spot, his shadow looming over her, the doorway to the outside world forgotten as the ghosts of the last 3 weeks finally demanded to be heard. The air between them was thick, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a devastating storm. Taeyong's hand remained braced against the door, his knuckles white, while Doris stayed pressed against his heat, her palm flat against the frantic rhythm of his heart. The silence that had lasted for 21 days was screaming now, demanding an end to the charade. "You want to know why?" Taeyong's voice was a jagged whisper, his eyes searching hers with a desperation that bordered on agony. "You want to know why I turned my back on the only person who makes this life worth living?" He let out a sharp, self-depreciating breath and finally pulled his hand from the door, only to rake it through his dark hair, leaving it disheveled. The casual rebellion of his unbuttoned collar and the dark ink on his skin made him look less like a king and more like a man falling apart. "I stood in that hallway 3 weeks ago, Doris. I was coming to tell you that the Kim family have moved on the southern ports, that things were going to get ugly and I needed you close. And then I heard you." He choked on the words. His gaze dropped to the statement pendant resting on her chest, as if the jewelry itself were a witness. "You were on the phone with your sister. You said it so clearly. You said, 'I can't do this anymore, Mia. I feel so trapped. I just want to get out.'" Doris felt the world tilt. The memory of that phone call flashed through her mind, the frustration of being confined to the penthouse for her own safety, the exhaustion of watching Taeyong carry the weight of the world alone while she was sidelined. "Taeyong," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "Taeyong, I thought I had finally broken you," he continued, the words spilling out of him like blood from a fresh wound. "I thought the shadow of my world had finally extinguished your light. Every day since then, I've stayed in that guest suite, convinced that if I looked at you, I'd see the bags packed under your bed."
I thought if I stayed silent, I could freeze time, because as long as we didn't speak, you couldn't tell me you were leaving me. The raw terror in his eyes was blinding. This man who commanded an empire and moved through the underworld with the grace of a predator had spent 3 weeks hiding from a single sentence. He had interpreted her cry for help as a final goodbye. The cold politeness hadn't been an act of indifference, it had been a shield against the absolute destruction of his heart. Doris reached up, her fingers trembling as she cupped his face. The stubble on his jaw was rough against her skin, a sign of the many sleepless nights he'd spent alone. "You idiot," she whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek toward the plunging neckline of her red gown. "You absolute brilliant idiot." Taeyang leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as he let out a shuddering breath. He looked like a man who had been drowning and had finally found a pocket of air. "Tell me I'm wrong, Doris, please." "You're so wrong, it hurts," she said, her voice growing stronger as she looked into the amber of his eyes. "I wasn't talking about leaving you. I was talking about the walls you put up around me." Doris kept her hands cupped around Taeyang's face, her thumbs tracing the jagged tension in his cheekbones. The revelation of his fear that he had been mourning their marriage while she was still living in it made the air in the foyer feel thin and electric. She looked into his amber eyes, refusing to let him look away now that the truth was finally bleeding out between them. "Taeyang, listen to me," she whispered, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of his confusion. "Taeyang, when I told Mia I felt trapped, I wasn't talking about my wedding ring. I wasn't talking about the life we built or the man I chose. I was talking about the glass walls you put up to keep me safe. I was talking about being a spectator in my own life while you fought wars in the dark." Taeyang's breath hitched, his hands finally coming up to cover hers, pinning her palms against his skin. The touch was desperate, a man reaching for a lifeline. "I was trying to protect you, Doris. The threats, the things I have to do to keep this family on top, they aren't meant for you. I thought if I kept you at a distance, the shadows wouldn't touch you." "But the shadows are already here," Doris countered, her voice rising with a mixture of love and lingering frustration. "They're in the way you look at me like I'm made of glass. They're in the silence that's been rotting our home for 3 weeks. You think you're protecting me by shutting me out, but you're just leaving me alone in the dark to guess what's coming for us. That is the trap, Taeyang. Not you, not us, just this hollow version of a marriage where I'm an ornament instead of your wife." She stepped even closer, the deep red silk of her gown brushing against his trousers, the movement intentional and intimate. "I didn't marry a man who hides things from me.
I married the man who leads. I married the man who was brave enough to let me stand beside him, not behind him. When I said I wanted to get out, I meant I wanted out of this silence. I wanted out of the guest suite. I wanted to be back in our life, even if that life is dangerous." Taeyang let out a long, shuddering exhale, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. The scent of his sandalwood cologne and the raw ozone of his presence overwhelmed her. The rigid control that had defined him for 21 days was finally dissolving, replaced by a vulnerability that made her heart ache. "I thought I was being noble," he admitted, his voice a low vibration she felt in her own chest. "I thought if I bore the weight alone, you'd stay whole. I didn't realize I was breaking you by trying to save you. We stay whole together," she promised, her fingers sliding into the dark hair at the nape of his neck. "No more glass walls, no more separate rooms. If there is a war coming with the Kims or the Busosans, I want to see it coming. I want to face it with you." Taeyang pulled back just enough to look at her, his expression serious but no longer cold. The restraint was still there, but it was directed inward now, a focus on the woman in his arms who had just dismantled his entire philosophy of protection with a single conversation. He looked at her crimson lips, then at the defiance still burning in her eyes, and finally the heavy oak door behind her didn't seem like an exit anymore. It was just a piece of wood. The real world was right here, in the heat of their shared breaths. The silence that followed was no longer cold, but heavy with the gravity of the world Taeyang had been trying to hold back. Taeyang led Doris away from the door, his hand resting firmly at the small of her back, as if anchored by the touch of her silk gown. They moved toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the Seoul skyline glittered like a sea of fallen stars, indifferent to the violent currents moving beneath its surface. Taeyang stood before the glass, his reflection superimposed over the city he partially controlled. He loosened his unbuttoned collar further, the dark ink of the tattoos on his chest appearing like shadows creeping out from under his sharp black suit. The Kims didn't just move on the southern ports, Doris. They set fire to 3 of our warehouses in Incheon. They're not looking for a negotiation anymore. They're looking for a decapitation. He turned to look at her, his serious lines of his face etched deep by exhaustion. The night I heard your phone call, I had just received a package. It was a digital intercept, a recording of a Kim lieutenant discussing your routine. They knew which florist you visited on Tuesdays. They knew the exact floor of this penthouse. They were talking about you as if you were a bargaining chip they could just reach out and pluck from the board.
The shipping yards are being signed over to a community trust. The logistics firms are being audited by the city. I am liquidating the empire, Tracy. All of it. Tracy stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. Why? Because I humiliated you at the gala? Because you were right, Jinwoo said, taking a step toward her. I thought I could control the fire. I thought if I used the darkness to build something good, the darkness wouldn't count. But I watched you stand on that stage and risk everything just to tell the truth. You were willing to lose your center, your safety, and your future just to keep your soul. He looked at the crumbling brick of the center behind her. I realized I'd rather be a man with nothing who is worthy of your respect than a king who has to trick you into staying. The air between them crackled with the weight of his choice. This was the burning of the convoy. He wasn't just giving up money, he was giving up his protection, his identity, and the only life he had ever known since the day his mother's center burned. By liquidating Lotus, he was making himself a target for every rival he had ever stepped on, including the Vanes. He was choosing to be vulnerable. You're going to be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life, Tracy whispered, her heart aching for the man behind the monster. I've been looking over my shoulder since I was 8 years old, Jinwoo replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. At least now, when I look back, I won't see a trail of lies. I've cleared the debt, Tracy. The Bugatti, the contract, the center, it's all gone. There is no more leverage. He turned to walk back to his car, but Tracy called out his name. He stopped, his back to her, his shoulders tense. Why are you really doing this? Is this just another move to get me to stay? Jinwoo turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the streetlights. I'm doing it so that if I ever ask you to stay again, it will be the first time in my life I've asked for something I didn't already own. I'm choosing to be better, Tracy. Not for you, but because you made me remember that I could be. He didn't wait for her to answer. He got into the car and drove away, leaving Tracy standing at the gate. As the taillights faded into the city night, she realized that the man who had crashed into her life to trap her had just destroyed everything he possessed to set her free. The debt was settled, but a new, far more complicated question remained. What happened to a saint when the devil finally decided to change? 6 months later, the Bendel Community Center didn't look like a fortress anymore, nor did it look like a ruin. The scaffolding had come down, revealing a structure that honored its history while embracing a future that was finally secure.
The only question left is whether I'm standing behind you like a shield that can be discarded, or beside you as a weapon they never saw coming. She reached out and took the lapels of his suit, pulling him slightly closer. The scent of him, ozone and sandalwood, was intoxicating, but her focus remained on the serious, pained depth of his amber eyes. I reject this version of protection. I reject being the wife who waits by the phone for a call that might never come because her husband was too noble to tell her he was losing a war. I am a Lee. I took that name with my eyes open. Taeyoung's jaw tightened, the muscle leaping as he fought the instinct to push her back into the glass box he had built. He looked at her, really looked at her. Not as the fragile woman he needed to hide, but as the partner who had just survived 21 days of his own psychological warfare without breaking.
The mediators expect a show of power, he whispered, his voice losing its jagged edge and gaining a new lethal clarity. They expect me to be the lone dragon. Then give them something they aren't prepared for, Doris said, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. Give them a united front. If you go in there alone, you're just a man with an empire. If we go in there together, we're a dynasty. I want to be in that room. I want to be the one who watches your back while you're watching the door. I'm not your obligation, Tae-young. I'm your team. A slow, dark smile finally ghosted across Tae-young's lips, the first real expression of warmth she had seen in nearly a month. It wasn't the smile of a husband looking at a trophy. It was the look of a general recognizing an equal. He reached up, his hand tangling in the soft waves of her hair, pulling her forehead against his. 3 days, he rasped. If we do this, there is no going back to the way things were. No more secrets, no more separate suites. Good, she breathed against his lips. I was getting tired of the guest room anyway. The heavy oak door, once the focal point of her defiance, remained closed and forgotten as Tae-young swept Doris into his arms. He didn't carry her like a delicate prize. He held her with a fierce, grounding possessiveness that signaled the end of their Cold War. The journey from the foyer to their master suite was a blur of shadows and shifting light, the silence of the penthouse finally replaced by the frantic, synchronized rhythm of their breathing. When they crossed the threshold of their bedroom, the air changed. This was the space that had been most haunted by his absence, the vast, empty expanse of the bed, a nightly reminder of the 21 days he had spent behind the door of the guest suite.
Tae-yang set her down gently, but his hands didn't leave her. They slid from her waist to the small of her back, pulling her flush against him until the statement pendant on her chest was crushed between them. "I've spent 3 weeks staring at the ceiling in that other room," he rasped, his voice thick with the weight of the time they had lost. "Regretting every second I wasn't here. Regretting that I let a single misinterpreted word turn me into a coward." Doris reached up, her fingers trembling as she worked the remaining buttons of his white shirt, finally baring the intricate ink of the tattoos on his chest. "You weren't a coward, Tae-yang. You were just protecting a version of me that doesn't exist. This is who I am, the woman who stands with you, even when the world is burning." He leaned down, his lips ghosting over her shoulder, his breath hot against her skin. The deep red silk of her gown felt like a second skin, but as he reached for the zipper, it felt like the final barrier between them was dissolving. "I was drowning," he admitted against her neck. "Every day I spent away from you, I was losing more of myself to the business, to the shadows. And let me be your heir," she whispered, her eyes closing as the dress slid to the floor in a pool of crimson defiance. The reconciliation was more than physical. It was a reclaiming of territory. Every touch was an apology, every kiss a vow. The coldness that had seeped into the marble and the glass of their home was scorched away by the heat of their reunion. In the dim, luxurious light of the room, the scars of their separation began to heal. They moved together with a desperate, beautiful intensity, a language of skin and soul that required no translation and allowed for no misunderstandings. Later, as they lay tangled in the high thread count sheets, the city lights outside casting long blue shadows across their intertwined bodies, the silence felt different. It was no longer a weapon, it was a sanctuary. Doris rested her head on his tattooed chest, listening to the steady, powerful thrum of the heart she had fought so hard to reach. Tae-yang pulled the duvet around her, his arm a heavy, protective weight across her waist. "The guest suite is being converted into a library tomorrow. I never want that door to be an option again." Doris smiled against his skin, the lingering tension of the last 3 weeks finally ebbing away. "Good, because I'm not finished with my demands yet. I have a lifetime to fulfill them," he promised, kissing the crown of her head. In the quiet of their reclaimed room, the Mafia boss and his wife were no longer a tragedy of errors. They were a unified front, ready for whatever the morning and the Kims
had in store.
The 3 days leading up to the mediation passed not in a blur, but in a series of sharp, focused movements. The penthouse had shed its skin as a mausoleum, transforming instead into a high-altitude war room. Gone was the icy silence of the previous weeks, replaced by the low melodic hum of strategy. They worked in the study, surrounded by leather-bound books and the glowing screens of secure tablets, the air thick with the scent of Taiyang's sandalwood and the metallic tang of Doris's resolve. Taiyang sat at the head of the mahogany desk, but he no longer sat alone. Doris was tucked into the chair beside him, her laptop open, cross-referencing shipping manifests with the Kim family's known shell companies. When Taiyang reached for a file, his hand often found hers first, a brief squeeze of fingers that served as a silent check-in. The noble distance had been replaced by a tether that seemed to hum with shared electricity. "The mediators expect me to be defensive about the Incheon fires," Taiyang noted, his voice back to its authoritative gravel. He traced a line over a map of the southern ports, his tattooed thumb stopping at a specific pier. "They think the Kims have me cornered." "Then we don't lead with the fires," Doris countered, sliding a ledger toward him. "We lead with the digital intercepts. If the mediators see that the Kims were planning to destabilize the Port Authority before the fires even started, the narrative shifts from a gang war to a breach of the Council's neutrality pact." Taiyang looked at her, a glint of pride surfacing in his amber eyes. "They won't see you coming, Doris. They'll be looking at me, waiting for the dragon to roar, while you're the one holding the blade to their collective throats." As the morning of the meeting arrived, the ritual of dressing was no longer a solitary act of war. Taiyang stood behind her, his hand steady as he helped her into a sharp-tailored black suit that mirrored his own, the fabric charcoal sleek and imposing. He fastened the statement pendant around her neck, his touch lingering on her skin. "Ready?" he asked, his reflection meeting hers in the mirror. He looked lethal, the tattoos on his neck partially hidden by a crisp collar, the embodiment of a power that was no longer isolated. "Ready," she breathed. They descended the grand staircase together, a synchronized unit that radiated a terrifying, quiet confidence. There was no hesitation as they reached the heavy oak door. Taiyang opened it, but this time he waited for her to step through first, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. The elevator ride down to the lobby was silent, but it was a silence of anticipation, not of distance. As they stepped out into the crisp morning air, their security detail moved with practiced precision, but Doris and Taiyang remained the focal point. They were no longer just a mafia boss and his wife. They were a dynasty reclaimed. As the black sedan pulled away from the curb, heading toward the neutral ground where the mediators waited, Taeyang took her hand in his grip unbreakable. The Kims and the Bususans were waiting to find a crack in the foundation, but all they would find was an unstoppable front. The war was just beginning, but for the first time in 21 days, Doris knew exactly how it would end. Together. The heavy glass doors of the council chamber swung open, and the room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. The mediators, flanked by the grim-faced lieutenants of the Kim and Bususan families, looked up in unison. They had expected Taeyang Lee to arrive alone, a wounded lion ready to negotiate the terms of his retreat. Instead, they saw a dynasty. Taeyang moved with a lethal, renewed grace, but it was Doris who commanded the air. In her tailored black suit, her expression was a mask of cold, sharp intelligence that mirrored his own. They didn't just take their seats, they occupied the room. Taeyang leaned back, his hand resting openly over Doris's on the table, the dark ink of his tattoos a stark contrast to her skin. He didn't lead with a roar.
He didn't have to. We aren't here to discuss our losses. Taeyong's voice cut through the tension like a blade. We're here to discuss your exit. Doris slid a single digital tablet into the center of the table, her eyes locking onto the Kim patriarch. The trap was gone. The silence was over. As the enemies realized they were facing a unified front, Taeyong and Doris shared a brief, knowing look. They were finally exactly where they were meant to be, side by side, unstoppable.